So, scene one. The first thing that I would like to talk about is that in the beginning of scene one, Macbeth and Banquo see each other. And remember, in the beginning of the play, Macbeth and Banquo are portrayed as allies. They're both generals. They're both honored together. They seem like good friends. Banquo doesn't seem jealous of Macbeth, even though Macbeth gets a little bit more of the honor from the king for their victory in battle. But already in this scene, Macbeth has kind of gone closer with his wife and committed himself to the act of murder, and we see him distancing himself from Banquo, right? Banquo says to Macbeth, when you have a little bit more time, let's talk about the weird sisters. Banquo talks to his friend and says, hey, when we met those witches, it was really weird, my friend. Let's discuss this. Some of what they said came true. But Macbeth says, and he lies, I think not of them. I do not think of them, right? So he is lying to his friend. Right? And this is an indication that his kind of personality is changing. And I think it would be too much to say that it foreshadows the death of Banquo, but perhaps it shows some of the distance that occurs between Macbeth and his friend that allows Macbeth to justify killing his friend in cold blood later on in the play. A second moment in the first scene of Act 2 that's important is that Macbeth sees a supernatural vision for the second time, right? Of course, that's if we count the meeting with the witches as a supernatural vision. And I guess to some extent that's debatable. But he sees the dagger in front of him. And earlier in Act 1, as we mentioned, Banquo is with Macbeth and they both see the weird sisters. They both see the three witches. So we know that it's not just that Macbeth is crazy because someone else sees it, right? There must be some reality, even if it's a supernatural reality, behind their encounter with the three witches. But here, Macbeth sees a dagger in front of him, right? And we don't really know if it's just Macbeth going crazy. And indeed, as we're going to see, Macbeth himself wonders this. Thirdly, Macbeth makes a comment that nature seems dead, right? And this comment operates both literally and figuratively. So let's take a look at what that means. First of all, when he says nature, what I think he means on the surface level is the natural world. And what he's talking about really is the nighttime atmosphere is totally dark. He comments on some of the sounds, the nighttime sounds of nature, and nature seems dead. It's asleep. In a sense, the nighttime seems like death and the daytime seems like life, right? So on the more literal level, this is what Macbeth means, right? But in a sense, nature seems dead operates figuratively too, and by figuratively, we really mean metaphorically. Because in a sense, I think, Macbeth's human nature, right, the traits of loyalty, virtue, and compassion are going to die in Macbeth or have already died, allowing him to decide to kill his king Duncan, who in Act 1 he had reasoned was a good king and his family member and his guest and someone he shouldn't kill. So here are three opportunities for analysis in Act 2, Scene 1. Of course, later in our lesson, Section 8, we're going to look at the long soliloquy, the dagger speech, also in this scene, and we're going to have a lot more to talk about. But for now, these are some opportunities for further analysis. So in Act 2, Scene 2, Macbeth returns to his wife to report on what has transpired, how the murder of Duncan went, right? So there are a couple moments in this scene that I think are opportunities for further analysis and further commentary. The first of these is Lady Macbeth seems softer in this scene than she was in Act 1. So Lady Macbeth's character is beginning to change. She says, had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. Right here, the apostrophe T means IT. Right? So what she's saying here is that if Duncan, he is Duncan, had not resembled my father as he slept, I would have done it myself. Okay? And the very fact that Lady Macbeth sees Duncan and is reminded of her father shows that she has a little bit of love and compassion in her heart. This kind of speech is very different from the speech we see in her soliloquy in Act 1, when she says that the raven is hoarse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements, right? Here, Lady Macbeth shows a little bit of evidence of the milk of human kindness, if we're to use her language, right? So something that we can kind of draw from this comment is that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are dynamic characters. This means that their characterization develops and evolves in response to the events that transpire in the play. Macbeth goes from a virtuous and rational person who's very careful in Act 1 to someone who by Act 5 is really unreasonable, crazy. He's completely overconfident and convinced that he's not going to be defeated, and he lacks any of the kindness that his wife chastises him for in Act 1. Conversely, Lady Macbeth goes from a ferocious person, whom we meet in Act 1, to someone who in Act 5 is sleepwalking and weak and ultimately dies by her own hand. Okay, so the development of characters is one way of understanding the impact of the actions that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth take in Shakespeare's play. Another moment that's important is Macbeth immediately shows regret for his crime. One of the first things he says in Act 2, Scene 2, after the murder of Duncan is, "This is a sorry sight." Right? And of course, he's kind of looking at his hands covered in blood and saying, "This is a sorry sight. What have I done?" Another interesting thing that Macbeth says that shows regret is he says, "But wherefore could I not pronounce amen?" So he talks about hearing people saying their prayers before they went to bed, right? Traditionally, Christians would say their prayers and say, "God, protect me in my sleep," before they went to bed. Okay, so before he commits the murder, he hears this. And normally he would say amen, which means I believe. Okay, and it's the way that a Christian prayer is traditionally ended. But Macbeth couldn't say amen. And he's asking himself in front of Lady Macbeth, wherefore or why could I not pronounce amen? So immediately after the murder, Macbeth regrets his actions and he begins to contemplate, what is the significance of these actions on my soul and morally for me? Okay, so it's kind of interesting because in Act 2, Scene 1, in the dagger scene, Macbeth kind of steals his nerve and says, "I'm going to kill Duncan. He's dead." But in a sense, we have to ask the question, is that an illusion? Is he kidding himself? Because immediately after the murder, this brave general, who was characterized for us as violent and a fierce warrior, is undone by murdering an old man in his sleep. Let's take a look at Scene 3. So, Scene 3 begins with the porter scene, okay? And it's important to comment on this. The porter is the doorman, okay? He is a low character, meaning most of the characters in Macbeth are nobility or kings and queens. But the porter would have been a lower or working class character whose job was to open the gate at Inverness at Macbeth's castle. Okay, so one role of the porter is to provide comic relief. And this is a technique that Shakespeare famously uses. And I'd like to ask you, have you ever been watching a scary movie or a thriller where while you're watching, you feel very, very tense and physically uncomfortable? Right? Every scene is so suspenseful, you're always worried something bad's going to happen to the character you care about, that you almost have to turn off your television for a second, get up and walk around, and you feel your heart beating, right, faster as you're watching the TV. Well, this is a sign that the television show or the movie you're watching is effective, it's good, it's gripping. But if you're in that state of tension for too long, it becomes unpleasant. I know this happens to me sometimes when I watch thrillers or scary movies. So Shakespeare is aware of this as a master of the theater, and he knows, I just had my characters meet witches, I just had them change from good, virtuous, loyal people to evil killers of the king, and my audience is probably really tense and scared right now. I need to give them a break. So the porter comes out, and he's still a little bit drunk because he had a lot to drink at the banquet celebrating the victory the night before, and he talks about being drunk in a silly way, okay? And it's beyond the scope of our course to look exactly at what he says, but it's a little vulgar, to be honest with you, a little inappropriate, and that's part of its humor. And he's speaking in a way that would have made the audience laugh. So all of this tension we have from the rising action, for a moment, we have a break from it, which allows the play overall to be enjoyable. Okay. Another moment in scene 3 that's important is that Lennox, one of the Scottish noblemen, he comments on the night, right? Because Lennox and Macduff, they didn't sleep at Inverness the night before. They arrive in the morning, okay? And they're expecting to meet with the king and to meet Macbeth, their ally, right? So in a sense, this is another example of the doubleness that we were talking about, because earlier in the play, we have Duncan and Banquo arrive at Inverness at Macbeth's castle. And what do they say? They say, oh, the air is sweet, right? There is a bird, the martlet, that haunts temples and is a sign of this being a holy place. But now we have two different members of the Scottish nobility arriving at Inverness, and this is after the murder. And they don't talk about the air being sweet. They don't talk about beautiful holy birds that symbolize goodness and church. Instead, they say that the night was unruly, which means chaotic. They say that there are screams of death. Right, think about that. While they're traveling to Inverness, they hear screams of death. And they hear prophesying, right? So on the one hand, the screams of death remind us of the murder of Duncan, and the prophesying reminds us of the witches. But even if we can't conclude that that's what Lennox and Macduff hear, it's interesting that we have first Duncan and Banquo describe the pleasant impression of Inverness on their trip there. And then later, in Act 2, we have Lennox and Macduff describe a completely opposite impression. So again, we have doubleness, right? Two events happen that are similar, but they're similar and they're also different, right? They're like inverted. They're kind of they're reversals of one another. So again, we have this kind of motif of doubleness and inversion, which we're going to explore more comprehensively in our final lesson in our close reading course on Macbeth. A final comment we can make about scene 3 is that Macduff describes the murder as sacrilegious and Duncan's body as the Lord's anointed temple. And I want to bring this up because in our second section, we talked about the historical context of the play. And we talked about the divine right of kings. Right? Which said that God appointed the king. And we talked about how the king is sacrosanct, which means the king cannot be questioned. To think that the king should not be king is a completely illegal and immoral statement and disloyal statement. So we kind of see Macduff here. When he calls the murder sacrilegious, he's kind of showing the way that the political authority of the king is merged with the religious authority of the king, which is something that I think is stemming from the historical context and meaning of kingship in Shakespeare's day. Right? And also has to do with the recent events of the Gunpowder Plot and James I's ascension to the English throne. Okay? And when he says that the body of the king is the Lord's anointed temple, again, anointed means chosen or blessed. It's the idea that God chose the king, Duncan. So Macbeth's murder has gone not only against the king and the political authority, but also against the religious authority. And finally, I think we can say that Macduff here, his reaction is totally different from Macbeth's, right? Macbeth is the one who kills Duncan, and Macduff is the one who kind of represents the more virtuous idea of how a subject, how a nobleman should regard the king, right? With respect and even religious respect. Okay, so scene 3 of Act 2 is quite important because this is when the body is discovered. When we take a look at scene 4 of Act 2, in this scene we basically have Ross talking to an old man, and their conversation reflects the way that people are viewing the murder. And one thing we want to notice throughout the play is that, we can kind of draw a graph, right? Right, suspicious, meaning they believe that Macbeth did something, and, trusting meaning they accept the murder of Duncan as it appears, that the guards did it, right? So in the beginning of the play, the nobles are pretty trusting, but by the end of the play, they're really suspicious of Macbeth, right? This is like Act 5, and this is Act 2. So right now, Ross and the old man don't give any evidence that they definitely believe that Macbeth committed the murder. But the way that they're speaking sets the stage for nobles to later believe that Macbeth is the murderer, and hence to want to join with Malcolm and Macduff in overthrowing him. Okay? A couple of phrases that they use. Ross comments that the dark night strangles the traveling lamp. This is an important quotation. The traveling lamp here is the sun, right? A lamp gives light, just like the sun does, and the sun travels through the sky, right, from east to west over the course of the day. So the traveling lamp is a metaphor for the sun. And what Ross means is that the nighttime is darkening the day. Okay, so again, kind of like when Macbeth says earlier in Act 2, Scene 1, that nature is dead, what Ross means here is that nature has kind of been inverted, right? Night has become day. And we can't help but wonder, is it the evil, unnatural deed of killing the king that has flipped the logic of the world and made night into day? And indeed, this paradox reminds us of the paradox uttered by the witches in Act 1, Scene 1, when they say that fair is foul. Right? To say that night is day is a contradictory statement, a paradox, and to say that fair is foul, again, is a contradictory statement, a paradox. Okay? Another moment in this conversation that's important is the old man tells a small anecdote, a small story of something that he saw. He says, a falcon, towering in her pride of place, was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed. So we have an image of two birds. Again, birds seem pretty important in Macbeth. I would encourage anyone out there who has to write a paper on Macbeth, perhaps to explore birds as a motif in Macbeth. But we see a falcon and we see an owl, right? Now, a falcon is a pretty strong predatory bird, right? I mean, aside from maybe eagles, falcons are known to be fierce predators and strong birds. An owl isn't exactly known for being weak, right? But an owl isn't considered as fierce as a falcon. So the old man says that a falcon was by an owl hawked at and killed. So the owl kills the falcon. Okay? So this is yet another inversion, a reversal of the way things should be. The sun is dark, fair is foul, and the owl kills the falcon, and the subject kills the king, right? All of these things involve a reversal of the way things should be. Night is day, fair is foul, the subject is the king, right? So I think that this imagery aligns with the events that transpire in Act 2. And really, this scene of Ross and Macduff talking to each other, right? The old man and Ross, and then Macduff enters. It kind of shows that there's room for them to begin suspecting Macbeth. They don't yet believe that Macbeth did it, or at least we don't know that that's the case, but they use words like seem. They don't use definite language when they talk about Malcolm and Donalbain being the ones behind the murder. Okay, so again, Act 2 is really about the rising action, setting things up for the climax when Macbeth hires the murderers to kill Banquo and Fleance, but the murder fails, and then for the falling action to zoom down towards the tragic conclusion that we see in Act 5.